Quebec. And so Quebec is one of the regions, but of all the regions, it's the one that's the most distinct. It's the one that's the most different than everyone else. So much that they have their own flag. One of the regions that we'll come across will have their own flag. And so here's the Quebec flag here, which is a very strong part of their beliefs. Here we have Quebec in red. This is the Canadian Shield. Most of the people that live in Quebec live in between the Canadian Shield and the Appalachian Mountains, where we have the St. Lawrence River. There's Quebec City, there's Montreal. Quebec City, Quebec is named Algonquin for where the river narrows. And that's where the St. Lawrence River does narrow. Here's an image from the Canadian Shield, and you can see the characteristic vegetation type. Keep in mind here's the Canadian Shield. It's very, very much just a rocky surface. Further, this area was recently covered by glaciers, and that explains this lake here that's been left behind by a glacier. Further, we can see the distinctive evergreen trees that are characteristic of Quebec. One of the things about Quebec is they have lots of science and engineers and innovations. In particular, a guy named Bombardier. Bombardier still has a strong role here in the Indianapolis 500 as a sponsor, but he invented the first ever snowmobile. And it would make sense that someone from Quebec would invent the snowmobile to help transport themselves during that very brutal, harsh, cold winters. Here's another key part of Quebec is the fact that in the northern part of the country, overwhelmingly First Nations. First Nations being what they call Native Americans. And so we still see a strong legacy of Native Americans today, but over time they've been pushed up to the less desirable areas of Quebec up in the northern regions. One area in the northern regions, you can see the Aurora Borealis, or the Northern Lights. This is only in the extreme northern part of the northern hemisphere can you see this, but the natives view this as the gods looking down on them. So they actually see these as being very spiritual. But once again, you can only see those way up close to the Arctic Circle. Here's a map that shows the red being Canadians, but the brown being the Native Americans. And so you can see how the Native Americans have over time moved to this more northern area. So here you see groups that are similar to what we would think of as the Eskimos, the Inuit, but as you note with the population density map, it's very sparsely populated in this area. But that makes sense, it's a Canadian Shield. It's extremely barren, and ain't nothing but pine trees in that area. Where do most people live? They live here once again in the St. Lawrence River area where we have at Quebec City and Montreal. So overwhelmingly most people in Quebec live in that particular area. But there's a strong connection to France. And it makes sense. If we think about France latitudinally, it's essentially the same place in which those clusters of Montreal and Quebec City are found. And so central France is a very similar climate to what we'd find in Quebec. And so a lot of the people, once again, move to an area of similar climate and vegetation. If we look at Quebec today, kind of a quick snapshot, overwhelmingly most people are Canadian or French. They identify with one or the other. A very small percentage of what we think as First Nations. If we go through a population graph, we can see how population in Quebec has increased considerably, but it started to slow down, starting in the 1960s. I'll come back to that idea. 83% Roman Catholic. So what that is essentially, this is a place which is overwhelmingly one particular religion, in this case Catholicism, but that number is decreasing. We'll come back and explain the reason why for that. Here's a population pyramid for Quebec. And you can see how they've had the baby boom, but they've since had a decline, and a very continued decline from there. What's happened there is a change in overall viewpoints of birth rates and development in Quebec. People realize that having 10, 12 kids isn't as cool as it used to be. So one of the things that's happened is there's been demand for less of a role of Catholicism in people's life and more of a promotion of Quebecois, French-speaking culture. And this is one of the key individuals from the Quiet Revolution. In Quebec, there is a separatist movement which Quebec wants to be separate from the rest of Canada. Here's a zoom into the two main cities we find in Quebec, Quebec City, and Montreal. And you can see how what it is the river essentially narrows here, in which ships have a little bit difficult time going any further, which is why Quebec City was always a shipping, fur trader location, and it kind of has that shipping legacy today. Montreal, much different. Montreal is more of an American city. It's been more influenced by Americans. And we can see that when we look at religion. Montreal, a more diverse array of religions, where Quebec City, overwhelmingly Catholic. So Quebec City is where we find the hardcore people who want Quebec to become its own country. And they relate that to the fact that they speak overwhelmingly French. Now, there is still a strong presence of religion, or I guess the absence of other religions. And so what they have is they have these new rules in which these are things that are acceptable to wear, in a Muslim-influenced neck or earring and all of that. These are things that are not allowed. And so you can see kind of this preference for Catholicism overwhelmingly and kind of this disagreement with others. Cirque Du Soleil, very popular, actually came out of Quebec. Cirque Du Soleil was originally street performers in Quebec City, who then over time has taken their show somewhere else. Hockey, of course, Canadians love their hockey in Montreal. It's very much that case. For you tourism people, this here is the most photographed hotel in the world. This most photographed hotel in the world is in Quebec City, and it uses a lot of rock from the Canadian Shield. It uses a lot of nearby rock. You can see how a very scenic location here, but it's got a very much the downtown's up high, but also a lower area there. Finally, if you look at cultural, I just decided to look at beer. And so one of the new beers that's coming out of Quebec, using obviously the French term "la fin du monde," which means the end of the world. As explorers were coming from Europe, they thought that this was the end of the world. But of course, you can see the legacies of the French. They're corking their beer. And we don't cork beers in the United States. When we look at Twitter trends, I kind of got some trends in Indianapolis Worldwide from last night. Montreal, it's Michael Barrett. It's the one you don't see anywhere else. He saved a guy from jumping off a bridge. This right here, chart. Chart is that policy in Quebec that I talked about earlier, where it's eliminating religious headdresses, is the chart. So you can see how that's a big part of discussion. That's all I got.